So today we are going to go over the best weapon for every single area in Elden Ring, which basically means like what's the best weapon that you can get in LIMGRAVE, the best weapon you can get in LIURNIA, so on and so forth. One of my chatters in my stream just recommended I make this video. It sounded pretty cool, so we're gonna do it. Now, starting off with the best weapon that you can acquire in LIMGRAVE, it is going to be the Bloodhound's Fang. Now, LIMGRAVE has plenty of good weapons like the greatsword, the Uchigatana, the Lordsworn Straightsword, and even the Nagakiba can be acquired in this area. But the Bloodhound Fang is just going to be the best of the bunch. Now, this weapon actually is acquired south side of LIMGRAVE off an Everjail boss. But the reason as to why this is going to be an amazing weapon is because it's a curved greatsword, so it's going to have an amazing moveset, really nice range, good stance damage. This weapon does get a pretty decent strength and dexterity scaling, can result in very high amounts of damage. Its weapon skill, Bloodhound's Finesse, is very cheap, does high amounts of damage, has a follow-up iframe dodge with its secondary attack, and the weapon also does get blood loss build up, which bleed is going to be one of the best status effects in the entire game. It just results in even more damage in most cases. The weapon also does get boosted damage with jumping attacks, and on top of all of that, you actually can buff the weapon as well. It's a unique special weapon that requires Somber Stones, but actually can be buffed, which is very unique. So therefore, you can actually pair it alongside some more damaging buffs, or Blood Flame Blade to further improve the blood loss build up. The only downside that I could say about the Bloodhound's Fang is that if you wanted to use spells, this is probably not going to be the weapon for you because it doesn't get a faith or intelligence scaling, so it's not going to have synergy with those types of builds. But the fact that you do have one of the best melee based weapons in the entire game right at the beginning for you is obviously really good. Now, as for STORMVEIL Castle, the best weapon that you can acquire here is going to be the pike. The Misericord is also a very solid pick too. It probably is one of the best secondary weapons in the entire game because it does have really high crit damage. But the pike is just going to be incredible because this is one of the longest weapons in the entire game. It has so much reach, and it actually is a spear, so it's going to have a very quick moveset, get nothing but poking attacks, can be infused with many different types of good weapon skills, and there's literally nothing that actually counteracts the good range that it does get. It doesn't get like less damage or have a slower moveset. It's probably not my favorite spear in the game, but it definitely does make for one of the better ones. Now, as for the Weeping Peninsula, the best weapon is going to be the Rusted Anchor. The Zweihander and Claymore are just very solid picks too. You can also acquire a +8 Banished Knight Halberd in this area. But the reason as to why the Rusted Anchor is just going to be the best one here is because it's a great axe that gets piercing damage, and piercing damage is the best damage type in the entire game. And when you're landing counterattacks, you're just going to be doing even more damage, and it could just output just as much as like any strength weapon in the entire game, sometimes even more so than colossal weapons. And great axes also get amazing weapon skill options like Flaming Strike, Sword Dance, Lion's Claw, Cragblade. It doesn't really matter what you go with. In most cases, it's going to be perfectly fine because the Rusted Anchor is just that good. As for SIOFRA River, we're going to go with the Dragon Halberd. The Claimant's Harpoon is also an extremely good option if you actually want to go with an intelligence-based build. Getting 2 Claimant Harpoons and pairing it alongside the Ice Spear weapon skill definitely makes for one of the better builds in the game. But the Dragon Halberd, in terms of its ease of use and high damage potential, is just going to be incredible. Now, you do acquire this one off the Dragonkin Soldier, that you can only get to that section via a teleporter that's like roughly halfway through the section. But the Dragon Halberd is going to be really good because it gets like the regular poking attack Halberd moveset, which piercing damage is always going to be really good. It does get the spin to win heavy attack, so you're going to have really good at crowd control, and its weapon skill is it's going to be Spinning Slash, but like a reskinned version of Spinning Slash, to where it just buffs the weapon with frost and more lightning damage. Adds roughly 80 frost and 160 lightning damage, which is actually extremely good, which both of those things, frost and lightning, are just amazing different types of damage to have. But the skill itself is actually just very high damaging still. Against smaller enemies, it stun locks them very nicely, and even against larger enemies, it still performs very well because it does a lot of damage and it procs frost very quickly too. And on top of that, this weapon also does get the added benefit of just doing more damage against dragons, which a lot of dragon enemies tend to be weaker to piercing damage anyway, so something like the Dragon Halberd can definitely make very quick work with them. Now, as for LIURNIA of the Lakes, I'm actually going to go with 2 different weapons. The best one in this area is going to be the Darkmoon Greatsword. It is technically acquired in LIURNIA of the Lakes, but you get it like much later into the playthrough because it is acquired off a quest line in a secret location. And yeah, the Darkmoon Greatsword is like a top 2 weapon in this game. It outputs so much damage. It does a really quick frost build up. The fact that you can actually do projectile attacks that don't consume any FP and do upwards of 35 stance damage is honestly insane. But the other weapon that you actually can acquire just regularly in LIURNIA of the Lakes is going to be the Sword of Night and Flame. This one is located in the Carrier Manor, and this is also just an amazing weapon too. The only faith and intelligence option that you really have in this game. So if actually wanting to use different types of spells, this one is probably going to be for you. But even then, you probably don't even need to use spells because the projectile attacks that you get with this weapon skill are just incredible. The magic and the fire-based version are just really good. Both just output so much damage. They can be a bit expensive in terms of their FP cost, but pairing them alongside the correct talismans, they could be one of the best weapons in the entire game. Also, I do want to give a shout out to the Night Rider's Glaive. This is definitely the best halberd in the entire game and one of the better strength ones too. Now, as for CAELID, this area has so many good weapons. The Cross Naginata, the Moonveil Katana, the Ruins Greatsword, Star Scourge Greatsword. You can also get Guts' Greatsword too, but the Death's Poker is just going to be the best of the bunch in my opinion. Now this weapon actually is acquired off the Deathrite Bird boss, and I actually do have a guide on how to get this weapon pretty early on and actually upgrade it within like the first hour of the game, so definitely check that out if you actually do want to have an overpowered intelligence build early on. But the reason as to why the Death's Poker is so good is because it is output so much damage. Its weapon skill can actually serve as a projectile attack and actually go relatively far, and there's like nothing else in the game, maybe outside of the Zamor Ice Storm attack, that actually procs Frost as fast as this one, and it also doesn't even consume much FP as well, so the fact that you can just output this much damage for pretty cheap is kind of insane. As for the best weapon to get in Nokron, there aren't really that many weapons, but the Gargoyle's Twin Blade is probably going to be the best one, which yes, you do acquire off the Valiant Gargoyle's boss towards the end of the area. Now Twin Blades, I'm not too big on. I don't really care much for their movesets. Two-handed and one-handed, they tend to be pretty basic, but the power stance jumping attacks is where this thing is definitely going to shine, which yes, is obviously going to require you to go to New Game Plus if you do want two of them. But the reason why the Gargoyles is going to be really good is because it can be the highest damaging Twin Blade in the game. You just go all into strength and you can just output so much damage. Now the trade-off being is that it does get like the worst range out of all the Twin Blades, but as you can see with the gameplay, the damage is just way too high to pass up. And even like the weapon options that you do get with Twin Blades are actually very good. You get everything from pole arms, poking attacks, even smaller weapons. So Twin Blades can be very versatile. For AINSEL River, we're going to go with the Wing of Astel. Yeah, this one's just not even close. The Wing of Astel is one of the best weapons in the entire game. Very solid intelligence and dexterity based weapon. It's a curved sword, very quick moveset. Its weapon skill, Nebula, can output a lot of damage for not consuming much FP. And the stance damage is just through the roof. It could do upwards of 60 stance damage and just constantly just stagger enemies. Even the heavy attack that it gets is a projectile, which means that it doesn't actually consume any FP. And doing a fully charged attack at point blank range can just do upwards of 50 stance damage, which is like just as much as a colossal weapon. So literally a curved sword is like the best stance breaking weapon in the entire game, and just spamming the weapon skill and the heavy attack back and forth can just trivialize everything. Now, as for the ALTUS Plateau, I was kind of torn between two weapons, the Mariah's Executioner Sword and the Ordovis's Greatsword, but I ended up settling for the Ordovis's Greatsword. I think both perform somewhat similar, but I think the Ordovis's is just going to be easy to use and doesn't require much of a setup. They're both like short range types of weapon skills that do require to be fully charged to maximize its potential. The difference being is that Mariah's can actually output more damage, but the Ordovis's can actually output much more stance damage. But the stance breaking potential of the Ordovis's is just through the roof. Almost every single enemy in the game can just be fully stance breaking in this one attack, and most bosses in probably just two attacks. And it's not like it does bad damage as well. The damage is actually still pretty decent. Now the Mariah's could potentially out damage the Ordovis's, but only if you have a bunch of really good talismans and crystal tears pair alongside with it, because if you don't have these types of talismans and tears, it's definitely not going to perform as well. So purely based on ease of use, I think the Ordovis's is definitely going to take this one. I also do want to give a shout out to the Great Stars. Out of all the weapons that you can infuse, this is probably the best one that you can get. For Mount Gelmir, we're going to go with the Scavenger's Curve Sword. Definitely one of the better bleed type weapons in the entire game. The Raptor Talons can also be acquired in this location. Also does bleed. Also very good. You can get the Falling Star Beast Jaw as well. That's another amazing weapon. But yeah, the Scavenger's Curve Sword, I'm going to prefer it the most because Curve Swords have very quick movesets, meaning they actually can proc bleed very quickly. They also get access to basically all of the blood type of Ashes of War. So you can pair this alongside something like Bloodblade and have a very solid projectile attack. Or better yet, you could just go ahead and power stance the Scavenger's Curve Sword, and you definitely have one of the best New Game Plus builds there is, which that's basically the unfortunate part. You can only get one per playthrough, but with how fast power stancing curve swords do attack, there's definitely nothing quicker that can actually proc bleed than power stancing Scavengers. As for the Volcano Manor, it is obviously going to be the Blasphemous Blade. Serpent Hunter is pretty good, Magma Blade's pretty good too, but yeah, the Blasphemous Blade is just built different. Now, obviously this one is acquired off Rykard, the final boss of this area, and it is going to be the best Fate weapon in the game. I think it's just the best weapon in the entire game, period, because this weapon actually not only gets amazing damage and good scalings, but you also get health regen on every single kill. Its weapon skill gives you health regen on every single hit, and the projectile itself just goes incredibly far, goes through enemies, sends them flying, and just does amazing damage. That's basically all that you gotta know. Now, as for LEYNDELL, there are going to be plenty of good weapons here. The Bolter Grandsax, the Envoy's Longhorn, but the Starfist is probably going to be the best one here. It definitely makes for one of the better stance-breaking weapons in the entire game, and it's purely because of its charged heavy attack. It comes out so incredibly fast, outputs a lot of damage, does upwards of 30 stance damage too, and this weapon also does get inherent bleed, which obviously, as you mentioned, bleed is going to be incredible in this game, and with the fact that it's attacking this quickly, and you're having with two weapons as well, because you have one in each hand, you can actually proc bleed very fast. So you can basically build around this weapon multiple different ways, whether you actually want to go spec into bleed or just go all into strength and then spam those charged heavy attacks with crag bleed. Either way, it's going to make for a fantastic build. As for the Deeproot depths, we're going to go with the Siluria's Tree. You get this one off the Crucible Knights boss that's a bit into the area. But yeah, Siluria's Tree is going to be a really good great spear to have. Does get a split strength and faith-based scaling. Scales a lot better off that strength stat, of which its weapon skill is also going to scale off AR. And being that you kind of want to get more physical damage compared to the holy damage, I recommend just going into that strength stat. Unless you want to use spells, then going into faith is probably going to be better. But the reason as to why this is amazing is because it gets a very good moveset. The great spears just get a bunch of good poking attacks. You can use them with shields. The heavy attack of the Siluria's Tree is actually going to be a horizontal swipe, which typically a lot of great spears only get a bunch of pokes, so having a horizontal swipe is good for crowd control and is better hit detection in general. But the weapon skill is going to be the best part about it. Siluria's Woe, when used uncharged, doesn't do that much damage, but it can just be a nice quick attack that you can use at point blank range. But when fully charged, it definitely performs the best because it turns the projectile into like a cross map machine. It can just hit enemies at very far distances, and projectiles in this game can just trivialize a whole bunch of enemies. And pairing this alongside the Godfrey's icon could just make it do even more damage. So yeah, it's definitely one of the better faith strength weapons in the entire game. Now for the Lake of Rots, there are going to be like some okay weapons in this area, like the Dragon Scale Blade and the Bastard Stars. They're not too bad, but they're kind of just outclassed by other weapons. So the Alabaster's Lord Sword is going to be the best one that you can acquire in this area. It's a great sword that gets a very decent strength scaling. Doesn't really get that good of an intelligence scaling, but that's perfectly fine because you can just go all into that strength stat and just get a lot of damage. Even its weapon skill, Alabaster's Lord's Pull, does scale off your AR, so just going all into strength, you can just still benefit. And the weapon skill itself is just like a much better version of Gravitas. Gravitas as a skill is just not that good due to its like very short range, no hyper armor, not that good at damage. But Alabaster's Lord's Pull goes like twice as far, does way more damage, and for only consuming a little bit more FP. But arguably the best part about the Alabaster's Lord Sword is actually going to be its heavy attack. It doesn't get a different moveset, but it does just get more motion values with its heavy attack to where it does just as much damage as a Colossal Sword heavy. For whatever reason, I don't really know why, it's just doing a lot more damage than the other great swords do. So yeah, this one definitely makes for one of the more underrated weapons in this game. For the Mountaintop of the Giants, we're going to go with the Death Ritual Spear. The Cranial Vessel Candlestand and the Zamora Curve Sword are very good options, but yeah, this one is definitely going to be the best one. It's a spear that actually gets a pretty decent intelligence and dexterity scaling. Actually does get the same moveset as the Partisan, so it gets the cool horizontal swipe with its heavy attack, meaning that it has really nice variety with its moveset, but its weapon skill is definitely going to be the best thing about it. Spear Core Ritual. For only 20 FP, you rain a bunch of these like magic spears from the sky that can output a lot of damage. It can just shred larger bosses, and even if it gets smaller enemies, it can actually stun lock them pretty nicely. It can also do some very high stance damage too, which actually does pair very nicely with its critical damage because it does get 110 crit, which is higher than all the other spears. So not only are you going to get very good damage with the weapon skill, but you're also going to get very high damage of critical attacks. As for the Consecrated Snowfield, there is just a bunch of mediocre weapons in this location. The Golden Order Greatsword is just going to be the best of the bunch. I don't even like this weapon. It should just be like the Darkwind Greatsword for holy damage, but it's just not. But yeah, to start off with, it is doing holy damage, which is obviously not that good. Definitely the worst damage type in the entire game. It still is viable, but it just doesn't change the fact that it's the worst. Its scalings are kind of out of whack. You get like a D-scaling in dexterity, despite its like 22 dexterity requirement. Its weapon skill, although somewhat high damaging, is also just pretty mid. The first part serves like a little AoE attack, which can be okay. The follow-up attack is definitely the best part about it, but unfortunately you have to do the first part of the weapon skill first before you're allowed to get to that second part. You can't really just pick and choose whether you want to get the AoE or the projectile, which gets very annoying. So with how long of an animation it actually is, it just turns to be like more of a situational type of weapon, and the entire combo can be pretty expensive too. As for MOHGWYNS Palace, we're obviously going to go with the MOHGWYNS Sacred Spear, which you get off the boss itself, and yet this one is going to be the best arcane bleed weapon in the entire game. Does get a split strength scaling, although going into arcane is probably just going to be best because its weapon skill, Bloodboon Ritual, just decimates enemies. If they can be bled out, it's basically just a GG. It just does so much damage. Even if they can't be bled out, it still does decent amounts of damage, and it does it in a larger AoE too, so just hitting multiple enemies at once has just never been easier. And on top of that, it's a great spear, so it gets a really good moveset. It gets the longest range out of all the other great spears too. The weapon also just gets passive bleed. So yeah, this is definitely going to be one of the best weapons in the entire game. The best weapon in Crumbling FARUM AZULA is probably going to go to the Malekith's Blackblade. It was kind of a toss-up between this one and the Dragon King's Crackblade, which both are required off the main bosses in that area. I'm not really too big of a fan of both of these weapons, but I think Malekith's is just going to have more of a use because its Destined Death damage over time effect can just straight up melt every single boss in the entire game, and it definitely is going to be one of the better options to have in New Game Plus, which being that you actually acquire this weapon later in the game anyway, taking it into New Game Plus can be pretty decent. Now there are a couple of downsides of this weapon. One, it is doing holy damage, which is not that good, and two, its weapon skill does consume 40 FP and have a longer animation, and being that it is close range as well, you're probably going to get hit more times than not, but being that it does do enormous amounts of damage, you're probably going to win that trade. As for the HALIGTREE, we're going to go with the Envoy's Great Horn, which there are just not many weapons in this area that are that good or that are actually unique to the HALIGTREE to begin with. And as for the Envoy's Great Horn, this actually is a very decent weapon, but the reason as to why I would never really want to use it is because the Envoy's Longhorn exists, and that kind of does the exact same thing, but just way better. It does more damage and just does more stance damage, and it's a great hammer, which is like a better weapon class in my opinion. But yeah, the Envoy's Great Horn is going to be a colossal weapon, and its skill does work somewhat similar to the Envoy's Longhorn skill. It just shoots out one big giant bubble. It actually does go further than the Envoy's Longhorn, actually does have some nice tracking, does serve as like a nice AoE explosion. So against enemies that are further away, this one actually might be better to have, but the stance damage is not that high, and the boss melting potential is nowhere near as good as the Envoy's Longhorn, so it's hard for me to really justify using this one. And as for ELPHAEL, this area is just going to go to the Hand of Millennia, which obviously is acquired of Millennia herself. Now this weapon I'm not also too big of a fan of. I like a lot of the other katanas better, but that's not to say that this is bad at all. It is a katana that gets very good range, gets some pretty nice damage, also gets inherent bleed, and its weapon skill Waterfowl Dance can actually output a lot of damage for not consuming much FP at all. But with how much stamina that it does cost, with how long the animation can be, the fact that you get no hyper armor, also it just doesn't really proc bleed that quickly as well. It can just lead to a more situational type of skill, but if you do find your openings and actually use it sparingly, you can notice that it actually can be a very solid weapon. Anyway, that basically concludes the list. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. Let me know if I missed something. I might have, who knows. And please do like and subscribe because I do have some more videos coming along the way. Anyway, catch you guys around.